The name James Maybrick would become very well known for a number of reasons. One, a much debated murder case involving his wife. Two, linking him with one of the most famous unsolved serial killers of all time, Jack the Ripper. It was the Victorian era. The streets of Liverpool and London were bustling with both the rich and poor, and sometimes the two worlds would collide. James Maybrick was born in Liverpool, October 1838, to William and Susanna Maybrick, a family that was very well established in Liverpool. He was one of 6 brothers, living a privileged life, but death would plague this family. 2 of the 6 brothers dying very young. His brothers would go on to build their own lives, working in the cotton industry. One brother, Michael, became a well-known composer. James would eventually start his own cotton merchant business in 1871, with his younger brother Edwin joining him as a junior partner. In 1874, James left London for America to set up a branch of his cotton business in Virginia. While in Virginia, he became ill with malaria. It was treated with an arsenic and strychnine tonic, which wasn't unheard of in the 1870s. This seemed to work, and it's been suggested, as arsenic is addictive, that James became very partial to the allure of arsenic, as many did back then. This would be important for later reference. Years later, in 1880, James journeyed back to England, and while on the boat, the SS Baltic from New York, he met the wealthy and influential Baroness Caroline von Rogues from Alabama, and her lovely, beautiful 18-year-old blonde, blue-eyed daughter, Florence Chandler, affectionately known as Florrie. James was 24 years older than Florrie, but this didn't stop a romance from blossoming, and on arriving back in England, they had already decided to marry. In July 1881, St. James's Church, London, held the lavish wedding of James and Florrie. Florrie became pregnant rather quickly. She would give birth to a son named James Chandler, but known by his family as Bobo. A year later, the family returned to Virginia and would travel between there and Liverpool over a period of 2 years. The Maybricks began to suffer a decline in their business. So James decided to return to England with his family. He would resign from the Norfolk, Virginia branch and stay in Liverpool. The stress of his financial circumstances going into decline saw James relying more on arsenic powders. In 1886, Florrie gave birth to daughter Gladys Evelyn, but the cracks were beginning to show in the Maybricks' marriage. James's substance abuse was becoming more frequent and obvious. Florrie apparently discovered James had another woman. Now I'm just going to turn the clock back slightly to a younger James Maybrick before he met Florrie. It has been discovered that James Maybrick was previously married to a woman who lived in Whitechapel, London. In 1892, William McDougall alleged that Sarah Ann Robertson was James's first wife. Although no marriage certificate has ever been found, census records that were released in 1992 after the 100-year mark appear to confirm this allegation. Although she's listed as single in the census, other legal documents show her as Sarah Ann Maybrick, wife of James Maybrick. Upon her death on January 17th, 1927, she is listed in the records as Sarah Ann Maybrick, otherwise Robertson. Now we go back to Florrie's dilemma. This could have been the woman James had an affair with. By all accounts, he had several mistresses, one giving him 5 children. The couple grew even more apart, sleeping separately, living almost separate lives. Florence met a man called Alfred Brierly and also had an affair. In 1888, the family moved to a new home. It was a large estate with acres of land, but the marriage was all but dead. James's substance abuse would send him into rages, causing Florrie to fear for her and her children. She had, on one occasion, a black eye after an argument about one of his affairs. About 4 weeks after the attack on her, Florrie purchased a dozen flypapers. Also on that day, James received another of his prescriptions. A few days later, a package arrived containing more medicines for James. The next day, James Maybrick fell violently ill, having taken an apparent overdose of his substances, namely the arsenic and strychnine. James Maybrick lay dying, and the rumours trickled through the household. And on May the 11th, 1889, James Maybrick died. James's brother, Michael, took over all the family matters. Letters that had been sent by Florence to Brierly had been intercepted by the nanny, who apparently disliked Florrie. She would show these letters to James's brother Edwin, who in turn would show them to the other brother, Michael. Michael had heard quite a few rumours being spread about Florence. And that's exactly what they were, just rumours with no substance at all. But she was confined to her room, kept away from the outside world. She was stopped from seeing her children, as they were removed from the family home. She wasn't allowed to attend her husband's funeral. And it was then that it sunk in that the Maybrick family were of the opinion that she had killed her husband James. She was then formally charged with James's murder on the 14th of May. Florence, although ill with all that was happening, had managed to get hold of her lawyer, a Mr. Arnold Cleaver, and on the 18th of May the magistrates and others entered her room. Superintendent Brining said, quote, "This person is Mrs. Maybrick, charged with causing the death of the late James Maybrick. She is charged with causing his death by administering poison to him. I understand that her consent is given to a remand, and therefore I need not introduce nor give evidence." Close quote. They remanded her for 8 days while she lay in her bed. She was then quickly taken away to Walton Jail in Liverpool. On the 6th of June she was brought before the coroner's court to hear the findings. The jury consisted of mostly men who she had known from visits to her own home. The coroner asked for their verdict, and they all came to the conclusion, without evidence, that she had caused the death of James Maybrick. She was then remanded into custody. On the 13th, she heard the evidence brought against her. There was certainly not sufficient evidence that the cause of death was arsenic. The doctors couldn't say so. No arsenic had been found in the stomach. On further examination, a very small amount was eventually found in the liver. 2 doctors agreed not enough to kill him, but another thought it was enough. The analyst had found both arsenic and traces of arsenic in some bottles and things which had been found in the house after death. As to where they came from, or who had put them there, no one had any knowledge. This was the evidence they had. James's brothers, doctors, and servants all gave evidence against her. It was also alleged that the fly papers Florrie had purchased, that do contain a small amount of arsenic, had been soaked in meat juices and fed to James. But no fly paper fibres had been found in the meat juices. The trial was set for the 31st of July. A packed St George's Hall, Liverpool, on the 31st saw many well-dressed former friends of Florrie's adorning opera glasses. People apparently fought for tickets to get in. The streets were lined with hissing women as Florrie's van went past. Florence's trial was presided over by Mr. Justice Fitzjames Stephen, whose son was, weirdly enough, also a Ripper suspect. The judge's behaviour in court, practically steering the jury to a guilty plea, didn't bode well. The whole trial was set on rumours and speculation. Everyone seemed against her. But as evidence of James's arsenic addiction came out, and the evidence of the doctors stating that there was no proof of arsenic poisoning, and that there was no proof that arsenic was administered to him by Florence Maybrick, feelings towards her seemed to change. Her lawyers were sure she'd be acquitted. Although there was no real hard evidence against Florrie, after 38 minutes the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Judge Stevens placed the black cap on his head and delivered his sentence speech. Quote, "The court does order you to be taken from hence to the place from whence you came, and thence to the place of execution, and that you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and that your body be afterwards buried within the precincts of the prison in which you shall be confined after your conviction. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul." Close quote. People were baffled, and those that hissed at her before hearing the evidence were now hissing and shouting at the judge. Newspapers that covered the case saw it as a miscarriage of justice on both sides of the world. Well-known, influential people cried out for justice on behalf of Florence. After a public outcry, James Matthews, the Home Secretary, and Lord Chancellor Halsbury looked at the case. They said it was clear Mrs. Maybrick had tried to poison her husband, but there was reasonable doubt, so her sentence was changed to life imprisonment. In the 1890s, Florence supporters claimed to find more evidence in support of her case, but they couldn't get an appeal, no matter how hard they tried. Florence spent the first 9 months in solitary confinement at the Woking District Female Convict Prison. When she was moved to another cell, the strict rule of silence was imposed. This she found mentally exhausting and the worst kind of torture. After this passed, she was on hard labour, spending hours scrubbing and cleaning, emptying slops, working the kitchens, and lots of heavy lifting and carrying. On the 4th of November 1896, she was transferred to Aylesbury Prison. Florence would write to the Secretary of State to review her case. He responded with "not sufficient grounds." On the outside, she had friends trying to help. One such friend was told by the Secretary of the United States that he had been told by the Home Office that she'd been a disruptive prisoner. Many prominent people fought for Florence. It was ruled that the judge was biased, and he totally swayed the jury's decision. And this should have got her a new trial. Better still, released immediately. Lord Russell, who fought tirelessly for Florence's release up until his death, took it to the House of Commons, but once again his memorandum was quashed. After having spent nearly 15 years in prison, Florence Maybrick was released on Monday the 25th of January 1904. On her release, she spent 6 months in Truro, Cornwall, with the community of the Epiphany Sisters, where the remainder of her life term was served. This, she has said, was one of the happiest times she had ever had. Her voyage away from England was to her mother's home in France, where she found herself besieged by reporters, before returning home to America as Florence Elizabeth Chandler. Florrie struggled for work and ended her days as a recluse living in a bungalow with her cats for company. When somehow the locals discovered her identity, they kept her secret and made a pact to watch over her. She passed away on the 23rd of October 1941, alone, heartbroken on the loss of her children, and penniless. On her deathbed, a scrapbook was discovered with paper clippings of the case, photos and writings. The New York Times covered her story, and it made the top of page 1. In 1992, a diary was allegedly discovered in an attic somewhere in Liverpool. What was written in the diary left the true crime enthusiasts, and in particular those that follow the mystery of Jack the Ripper, shook.